There's an epic battle underway in the back rooms of Washington, D.C. A battle between those who want to continue business as usual, permanent war, destabilization, austerity, and defense of the fat contracts going to the defense and intelligence establishment at the expense of the American people. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 3rd, 2025. And what I have to tell you will determine what happens in the coming year, whether the Trump administration will be successful in fulfilling the pledges he made to stop wars and to uproot the deep state, or whether they will continue to have their way, in which case we're headed toward a danger of nuclear war. Now, this is not just about Trump. It's not just about Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel, who I'll be discussing briefly, but it's about a strategy to win the fight against the so-called deep state. And it's about the American people taking charge of the future. Now, those attacking Gabbard, who say that she's inexperienced, she's susceptible to disinformation, she's a Putin puppet, and all this nonsense, they were exposed by one of her spokesmen, who said that these are, quote, the same geniuses who have blood on their hands from decades of faulty intelligence, unquote. A reference to people like Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6, who attacked Gabbard as lacking experience and also a threat to the special relationship of intelligence sharing between the U.S. and the British. Well, that's precisely what should be threatened. That's what's led to one disaster after another. So I'm answering the questions I've received from a number of you of how do you win this fight to give Trump the capability to get his people in place, as opposed to in his first administration when there were too many neocons and never-Trumpers who shaped the agenda. Now, the key is, how do you end the power of the permanent bureaucracy? The hit teams that use censorship to counter any opposition, that use censorship to cover up for the operations, the false flags, the wars, the spending, and so on. Well, the most powerful strategy that I can come up with would be for Gabbard and Kash Patel to bring up the LaRouche case. Now, some of you are familiar with that. I'll just go through some of the details to give the rest of you some understanding of why this is so important. Before Trump considered running for president, Lyndon LaRouche was the point person in taking on the networks of the globalists, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs. LaRouche, through his commitment to the idea of restoring the constitutional system of the United States, was involved in promoting an attack on the International Monetary Fund, on the central banks, on the Federal Reserve, precisely because they represented a policy after August 1971 of speculation, of deindustrialization, of what Paul Volcker, who was a key operative in this, called the controlled disintegration. Now, LaRouche identified precisely who was involved, going back to the Carter administration, people like Brzezinski, people like Henry Kissinger. LaRouche testified, for example, in 1974 against the nomination of Nelson Rockefeller to be Gerald Ford's vice president after Nixon had been Watergated. LaRouche identified Brzezinski as the key operative behind Islamic fundamentalist terrorism to be used against the Soviet Union, but which eventually turned against the United States. He gave Ronald Reagan a strategy for ending the Cold War through the development and sharing of anti-missile defense systems. It was not carried out. Why? Because of the Get LaRouche Task Force of Henry Kissinger, of William Webster, of a whole crew of people that targeted LaRouche, including Robert Mueller, who ran the Boston legal case against LaRouche, which eventually was moved to Washington, which ended up with LaRouche getting a 15-year prison term for, quote, conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service. Now, LaRouche served 5 years, but he came out and continued to fight, exposing the fraud of the anti-Russia policy, presenting an alternative of economic development for the United States and for the developing sector. Now, telescope that to the present. The fight in the world is between those who are committed to developing a new security and development architecture based on investment in the physical economy and based on cooperation for mutual benefit, such as the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, versus those who want to continue the permanent division and enemies versus the sole superpower of the United States. That's what the fight is. And to the extent that Donald Trump talks about peace with Russia, cooperating with Putin, even cooperating with Xi Jinping, he's a threat to that system of permanent warfare. And that permanent warfare system, as Trump has pointed out, doesn't benefit the American people. It's not about your security or your prosperity. It's about protecting the billionaires and their corporate cartels. Now, the issue, therefore, since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, has been, will that permanent bureaucracy control the instruments of the executive branch, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the Justice Department? Or will the people, through their elected representatives, including the President and the Congress, have control over the institutions which will determine the outcome for the future? And that's what is at stake in the confirmation hearings of Gabbard and Patel in particular. Because what they represent is an alternative to the current permanent bureaucracy. Gabbard is being denounced by that bureaucracy. Patel has been attacked by that bureaucracy. Why? Because they stood up and identified the frauds of the current policy. Patel exposed Russiagate as an operation run by the British and the Obama administration Intelligence and Justice Department to stop Donald Trump from pursuing what he was elected to do. Gabbard exposes the fraud of the argument that Russia's special military operation was unprovoked. She's exposing the fraud of the use of so-called chemical weapons, the argument that Assad used chemical weapons, when in fact it's the British who used chemical weapons. It's British intelligence, which is committed to sustaining a war in Southwest Asia, sustaining the war in Ukraine, and spreading that war through global NATO to China. So what's at stake in these hearings is not just who has the position, but can we clean out the rot and corruption from the permanent bureaucracy? That's what LaRouche fought his whole life for. And that is a meaningful fight to have today. It's not just about exonerating LaRouche because he's a good guy, but it's because what he stood for and what we today stand for is the traditions of the U.S. Constitution of government of, by, and for the people, not of, by, and for the private interests of the military-industrial complex, the corporate cartels, and Silicon Valley. And it's important that you join this fight with us to strengthen the case for Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence and Patel for Director of the FBI, so that they can fight for our interests against the permanent bureaucracy. Now, toward that end, I would urge you to watch the video of the dialogue between Ray McGovern and Helga Zepp-LaRouche from last Thursday. Secondly, today at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, that's Friday at 11 a.m., there'll be the next Zoom call of the International Peace Coalition. I'd urge you to log on to that. If you can't get it live, pick it up later from the archive. And finally, on Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll be joining Diane Sayre and Dennis Speed to dissect this question of who is the permanent bureaucracy that has to be defeated and how we can do it. And we'll be specifically focused, besides on the Gabbard and Patel nominations, we'll focus on the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski as the creator of the destruction through his geopolitical doctrines of the potential for peace. So join us, watch these videos, become a member of the LaRouche organization, and make sure that this video is shared so that people can get the truth about who we're fighting and why.